Hello everyone. On behalf of Delaware Public Media and the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication, welcome to Delaware Debates 2024. I'm Ralph Begleiter. Delaware Debates is supported by the University of Delaware's College of Arts and Sciences and by the Department of Communication. For this debate, we invited candidates in the race for Delaware's single seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. The Democratic Party's nominee for U.S. Congress is Sarah McBride. She's an incumbent in the Delaware State Senate. The Republican candidate for Congress is John Whalen of Millsboro, Delaware. Mr. Whalen formally declined the invitation to participate in our debate, and he's not here. In the interest of public service, we are proceeding with our discussion with Senator McBride. The University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication highly values offering Delaware voters a face-to-face discussion of vital public issues among the candidates for high national elective office. We consider debates like this one among the historically important traditions of democracy. Voters get a chance to see the candidates in a structured, dignified discussion of vital issues before the votes are cast. The University of Delaware, the state's flagship educational institution, undertakes this task in election years as a civic responsibility to the state in support of civil public dialogue. Now, welcome, Senator McBride. We're very much appreciative of your participation in the debate. The candidates have agreed in advance to rules for this program, including holding their responses to specific time limits. We'll also have some questions posed by a student. Senior Casey Nyman, executive producer for Student Television Network here at the University of Delaware. Although the candidate has agreed there will be no opening statements, you will hear a closing statement later in the program. We'll try to keep our questions succinct and ask the candidate to answer concisely so we can cover as much ground as possible. Senator McBride, because it's really on the top of people's minds in this election, I'd like to start with the economy. That's what people say is their most important issue this year in the campaign. Even though national data on jobs, inflation, taxes, production, all show the economy is in good shape, what steps would you support to make voters feel better about the national economy right now?
Well, first off, Ralph, thank you so much for moderating today's discussion. Thank you so much to the University of Delaware for hosting this, and to all of the students who are here with us this evening and all of the students who are making this conversation possible behind the scenes. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to join us. The economy is without question the most important issue in this election. And as the Democratic nominee, this is without question the top issue that I hear from voters as I travel up and down the state: the cost of housing, the cost of childcare, the cost of health care. And while we are moving in a positive direction here in the United States, we have the strongest economy of any developed nation in the post-COVID-19 world. There's no question that the American dream is increasingly unaffordable and inaccessible for far too many of our neighbors. That has been the singular focus of my time in the Delaware State Senate, to bring down costs facing families, facing workers, and facing retirees, and it will be my singular focus in the United States House of Representatives. I am a strong believer that the federal government has an important role to play in making an economy that works for everyone and bringing down those costs. But in order to do that, we have to make Congress work better for people. We need people who have a proven track record of rolling up their sleeves, diving into the details, and bringing people together. And so from day one of my time in Congress, I'll work with Democrats and Republicans to make this economy work better for people across the state. That means investments in affordable housing to bring down the cost of housing. It means making healthcare more affordable and accessible by providing a public option to folks who are buying health insurance on the individual marketplace, by helping to recruit more providers to the state of Delaware. And it means making the cost of childcare more affordable, because right now a lot of families are forced to essentially pay more than their mortgage for childcare. And that means that if they can't access a quality childcare facility for their child, they not only are giving up that educational opportunity for their kid, they're also pushed out of the workforce. And so I would vote for federal investment in those areas to bring down those major drivers of costs facing families.
Senator, we'll come back to some of those topics as well in a few minutes, but as I think you know, elected officials and candidates talk a lot about cutting spending. That seems to be a recurrent theme in election campaigns. Can you list some specific things in the federal budget that you think you would vote to cut when you're in Congress?
Look, I think without question, there's waste and abuse in the federal government, as there is in every company, in every business, in every government. I want to make sure that we're cutting unnecessary red tape. I'd want to make sure that we're streamlining processes within the federal government, and I think that there are costs that can be saved through those types of endeavors. I do think we can spend money more wisely when it comes to our defense. But at the end of the day, I think the American voter does not believe that we should be cutting critical benefits or stopping ourselves from investing in workers, because the only way to grow our economy, the only way to make it work better for working people is to invest in the middle class. It's to invest in working people. And so I would be focused not on cutting critical government programs. I'd be focused on making sure that they work better for people and expanding them where necessary and where appropriate.
Senator, for another angle on this economic topic, and it's one you touched on in your initial answer, I want to turn to my colleague, Casey Nyman, UD senior here at the University of Delaware at the Student Television Network, for our next question.
Thank you, Ralph, and hello, Senator McBride. Many young people in the United States have voiced their skepticism about their futures compared to their parents and their grandparents. As you said, the American dream is something that's now pretty unattainable. What do you think Congress should do to reassure young Americans about the prospects of their future?
Well, I think for a lot of people across this country, including a lot of young people, there's a crisis of hope going on right now. And I think it's a crisis of hope rooted in the fear that we no longer have the individual or collective capacity to meet the scope and the scale of the challenges that we face. The only way to address that crisis of hope is to make government work better for people, is to build a government that truly respects us by delivering for us. And that includes young people. I think there are a number of steps that the federal government needs to take to make our economy work better for young people. One is address the cost of housing. We have a major housing shortage. And in order to address that shortage, we need federal investment in housing to build out the housing stock, not just here in Delaware, but across the country, to guarantee that we're redeveloping commercial real estate that's obsolete now into new housing, to guarantee that we're building in a smart way, and in so doing, bring down the cost of housing, while also providing folks financial support the first time they're buying a home, to put down that down payment, to be able to qualify for that mortgage. I also think that we have to have targeted student loan relief. I think the Biden administration has figured out the right path, giving young people who are struggling under the burdens of student debt targeted relief. We shouldn't be giving someone who's making 7 figures after getting their law degree from Yale student loan relief. But I think for folks who have gone to college because we have essentially told young people the only way to find financial security is to go to college, and they're working their jobs, struggling to pay their student debt, struggling to buy a home or pay for their rent, we need to give them some relief.
Senator, I'd like to follow that up again, because some of the issues you talked about, they're still not the whole story. I think as an older person, when a young person looks around them, they see a planet ravaged by climate change, to which they don't see much being done about it. They see the Supreme Court stripping them of personal rights to family planning and allowing those regulations and those rights to be regulated by state governments. They worry about home ownership, which you mentioned, and student debt, which you also did, the cost of raising a family. Some of them even worry about retirement security, even at a relatively young age, while they're paying retirement benefits for somebody of my age. What should Congress do to assure young people that the institutions of government to which they will turn in their growing lives will still be there covering their backs in the future?
Well, look, I think there's no question that if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And one of the reasons why we need a diverse range of voices in government is to make sure that we not only have diverse perspectives heard, but to make sure the needs and the interests of all people are heard and met. That includes young people. And so I think it's important right now that we increasingly see more young people run for office, serve in public office. I would be the youngest member of the federal delegation since then Senator Biden was sworn in 1972. And that means I bring a unique perspective. that when met with the experience of older members of Congress, guarantees that we have the diversity of thought, the diversity of experience, and the diversity of background necessary to understand the scope of the problems and to craft solutions that actually address them. But you're absolutely right, and 90 seconds is far too short to talk about all of the issues that are weighing on the minds of any one group of voters in this election, including young people. But I think if we have not only more young voices at the table, but if we actually make government work better and deliver for people, because I think that is fundamentally why people are giving up hope. They're seeing things not getting done, and the things that they're seeing get done, they don't like. It's the rolling back of rights, as you mentioned. And so we need someone in Congress who's not only going to champion individual rights, who's not going to just champion the dignity of every person in this state, who's not going to only champion good economic policy, but just as importantly, actually deliver, which is what I've done in the Delaware State Senate.
Now, obviously, the result of this is going to depend on the outcome of the election, but will you feel that everything you've just said is possible if a single party controls both the White House and both houses of Congress?
Yes, absolutely. I believe that if we flip the House and make Hakeem Jeffries Speaker of the House, if we keep the Senate, and if we elect Kamala Harris and Tim Walz to the White House, that we will be able to implement this agenda that I've mentioned, that Vice President Harris has outlined, that brings down costs facing workers and families, that makes housing more affordable, makes childcare more affordable, makes healthcare more accessible, that restores Roe v. Wade and protects our rights. And let me just say that we know that when Democrats are elected, not only do they get things done, but they get things done in a bipartisan fashion. The last 2 years in the United States House of Representatives have been governed by a caucus of chaos in the Republican caucus. But for the previous 2 years, when Democrats controlled Congress, we had the largest investment in infrastructure since the 1950s, the biggest expansion of veterans benefits since the GI Bill, the first gun safety package since the 1990s, the biggest expansion of health care since the ACA, and the single greatest step in human history to address climate change. Much of that was done with bipartisan support.
Another issue that's on a lot of voters' minds in this election is immigration. It may or may not be such an issue in Delaware, or as much of an issue in Delaware as it is in some other states. But early this year, Congress almost passed a new immigration bill with the support of a majority in both the Republican and Democratic Party in both houses of Congress. But it died, of course, when President Trump signaled Republicans to vote against it at the last minute. What I want to know is if it's revived in the next Congress, and of course, if you're a member of the next Congress, will you vote for that kind of bill?
Yes, absolutely. Look, I think immigration is the perfect example of what's wrong in our politics right now. We don't have to choose between a secure border and a humane immigration system. We can and we should have both. And that's where the vast majority of the American people are. And we were moving in that direction, as you mentioned, with a bipartisan border security bill that would have secured the southern border while also making improvements to the immigration system to make it more efficient and humane for those who are interacting with it. But that bill was killed by Donald Trump, by one man, because he wanted to continue to fearmonger on this issue and to exploit it for political gain. That's precisely what's wrong in our politics right now. We need serious people to grapple with serious issues, not professional provocateurs who are parading as public officials, which is what Donald Trump is.
Couldn't that happen again in a Congress to which you might be elected?
Well, my hope is that come November 5th, we relegate Donald Trump to the dustbin of history, and he is no longer able to control his Republican enablers in Congress. I believe that if Donald Trump loses, he will now be a 3-time popular vote loser and a 2-time electoral college vote loser. I think his influence on the Republican Party will wane, and hopefully we will see more grown-ups take over.
I want to turn to international affairs for a few moments because you may or may not have had to deal with that as a Delaware State Senator, but you are going to have to deal with it and cast votes on it if you become a member of the Congress. I'm going to ask you whether the U.S. and its allies should continue funding, training, and sending weapons to Ukraine's military fight against Russian invasion of Ukraine.
There is a global struggle between authoritarianism and democracy that's happening right now. It's a struggle, frankly, that we're seeing right now domestically between strong men who admire authoritarian dictators and those Democrats, independents, and Republicans of conscience who support small d democratic values. And we're seeing that struggle around the world. And there's no question that Ukraine is a critical front of that global struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. And I would absolutely support continued U.S. support for Ukraine in repelling Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion, because I think not only does Ukraine have to win that war because of our belief in self-determination and democratic values, I also believe that Ukraine has to win that war so we don't have an emboldened Vladimir Putin on the fringes of NATO in southwestern Europe, risking a conflict that further escalates in Europe, that ensnares NATO, and creates a global conflict.
In your campaigning around the state of Delaware, did the citizens of Delaware, the voters of Delaware, tell you that that aid and assistance to Ukraine should continue?
I overwhelmingly hear, when I hear on this issue, I overwhelmingly hear support for the U.S. continuing to support its allies, including Ukraine.
Sticking with global issues for a moment, the Middle East is a very complicated place, and we're not going to spend many minutes talking about it, but it's obviously something that is unfolding even as we speak right now. And again, you've not been called upon in the Delaware State Senate to deal with that issue, but you're going to be casting votes related to this if you're elected to Congress. Considering the ongoing Gaza war that was begun by Hamas last year, the second front war with Hezbollah and Lebanon, and now tensions with Iran over its role in the fighting, what role do you think Congress, U.S. Congress, should play in coming months in the Middle East?
Well, first off, I, like so many Americans, have been heartbroken by what we are seeing unfold in the Middle East over the last year and a half in particular. The conflict, as you mentioned, is complex and it's not new. But the last year of this conflict has been particularly tragic. From the October 7th terrorist attack that resulted in the murder of 1,200 innocent civilian Israelis, Jews and Muslims alike, to the unfolding hostage crisis, to the war in Gaza, and as you mentioned, now the war in the north against Hezbollah. And Israel, without question, has a right to defend itself against a terrorist attack like we saw on October 7th, to protect its citizens. And in fact, it has a responsibility to protect its citizens. But it also has a responsibility to do that within the context of all applicable laws. And I am desperate to not only see an end to the violence in its current form, but really a lasting and durable peace, which is why I've been so supportive of the U.S. government-led efforts to secure a ceasefire that stops the violence, releases the hostages, and creates a bridge toward a more durable peace. Because let's be clear, any ceasefire is inherently temporary until and unless we have a more permanent, holistic solution. And as a member of Congress, I would continue to speak out not just in support of the U.S.-Israel relationship, but for a two-state solution that guarantees a safe and secure Israel and a safe and secure Palestine, where Palestinians have both safety, security, economic security, and the right to self-determination.
One of the things Congress can do that other agencies may or may not be able to do, don't have the power to do it, is Congress has a power of the purse. If you're elected, you'll be able to vote on how to spend U.S. money. And so I want to just ask you whether you think the United States should increase or reduce its funding for U.S. allies in the Middle East, more than one ally in the Middle East, or to impose sanctions on parties to the conflict. And I'm asking about all the parties to the conflict.
So I absolutely think that now more than ever, the U.S. has to stand with its allies, and particularly its democratic allies, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. I believe right now we're at an inflection point, a critical point with the conflict in the Middle East, where you have not only an emboldened Iran, but emboldened proxies that are being funded by Iran that are inflicting harm on innocent civilians.
You're talking about Hamas and Hezbollah.
Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And I think if the United States were to turn its back in this moment on its allies, my concern, among many, my main overriding concern would be that it would be an open invitation for Iran to escalate its attacks on not only Israel, but other U.S. allies in the region. We, of course, have seen recently, once in April and once in earlier this month, Iran escalate to state-on-state attacks against Israel. But they did those attacks knowing, with the deterrence of the United States, to essentially do it in a form and fashion that limits casualties. If the United States were to turn its back on its allies, I would be concerned that it would be an open invitation for Iran to escalate even further than they already have, which could risk not just a state-on-state all-out war in the Middle East, but potentially a conflict that ensnares not just the United States, but other allies outside of the region.
I know we could spend a lot more time talking about the Middle East and other international conflicts, but I'd like to switch gears now to another series of national issues that are also on many voters' minds related to gender. And our UD student television journalist, Casey Nyman, has our first question in that series. Casey?
Yes, to switch topics a little bit, how do you feel about a national ban on abortion? And would you vote to reverse the Supreme Court's ruling and reinstatement of a woman's right to have an abortion? And do you favor enabling any limitations on an abortion as a device to stop states from enacting stronger bans on abortion?
So I would 100% oppose a nationwide abortion ban and would 100% support restoring Roe v. Wade and the protections that it guaranteed to millions and millions of women across this country who need and deserve access to the full range of reproductive health care. You know, my opponent is not here today, but in the one and only instance where we did have a debate, he explicitly endorsed Project 2025, calling it a plan to restore our republic. And a Project 2025 would result in not only a nationwide abortion ban, but a federally appointed inspector of women's reproductive health to go in and invade the privacy, not just of the individual decision that a patient might make with regard to an abortion, but the individual privacy of patients with regard to whether they're pregnant or not. And that is an egregious, almost unprecedented invasion of not only bodily autonomy, but individual privacy. And I would do in Congress what I've done as chair of the Health and Social Services Committee in the Delaware State Senate, which is to champion reproductive freedom. We codified Roe v. Wade under state law prior to my time in the state Senate, but during my time, we've made Delaware a safe haven for patients and providers alike for the full range of reproductive health care, including abortion care. And in Congress, I will continue to stop at nothing to champion reproductive freedom and to restore the protections of Roe v. Wade.
Now, I want to ask you, if I may, a question based on your own biography. If elected, you will become the first openly transgender member of the United States Congress. And while I don't want to dwell on that, I want to ask you this question. To what extent do you think, because of being the first, this historic opportunity there, to what extent you will be expected personally to somehow represent all transgender people beyond your constituents here in Delaware on the national stage, and particularly when it comes to legislation in Congress? Will you, is that something you look forward to? Is that something that you see as a burden, that you have to represent all, or?
Well, thank you for that question, and I think it's an important question because obviously there's a lot of media attention about one aspect of who I am, but it's not what I hear from voters. And I think time and time again, Delaware voters have demonstrated that they are judging candidates based on their ideas and not their identities. I'm not running to be known for any one aspect of my identity. I'm running to be Delaware's member of Congress focused on all of the issues that matter. Similarly, I'm not running to be a spokesperson for a movement. I'm running to be a voice for Delawareans. When that means defending the rights of my LGBTQ constituents, I will do that. When it means defending the dignity of Delaware retirees, I will do that. When it means protecting Delaware workers and their families, I will do it. When it means protecting the rights of Delawareans of color, I will do that. When it means defending women's rights, I will do that. I'm not going to do that as a trans person. I'm not going to do that as a person of any particular background. I'm going to be doing that as a member of Congress, one, and as a Delawarean who cares about my neighbors.
You don't think you're going to face media who will ask you in Washington those questions about people who are not Delawareans?
Sure, I think there'll be questions from the media. But one of the things that I have always tried to do is whenever there's been attention about any aspect of my candidacy that's unique, I have always tried to use that microphone to uplift the voices and the needs of Delawareans. So when I got elected to the Delaware State Senate, there was a lot of focus on one aspect of my candidacy. And I said, I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of Delawareans, that they are judging candidates based on whether they can deliver for them, not their gender. But I want to talk to you about what is actually at the heart of my service, and that was paid family and medical leave. And so over the last 4 years, I had the opportunity to introduce the Healthy Delaware Families Act to provide up to 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave for Delaware workers. We were able to do that in 1 year with bipartisan supermajorities in the Delaware General Assembly, in part because of the unique microphone that was offered to me because of one aspect of my candidacy. And I will continue to take whatever platform I'm given, whatever elevated opportunity I am offered because of certain aspects of my candidacy, to instead of talking about my own journey and me, to talk about Delawareans, to talk about their needs, and to talk about the policies that are actually keeping them up at night, the issues that are actually keeping them up at night, and the policies we need to deliver for them.
Okay. If you move to the federal Congress, you're going to have to deal with these issues, of course,
Sure.
as you've been saying. What I'd like to ask you about is, do you see issues like, we've talked about some of them, abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, civil rights more broadly, free speech questions such as what kinds of books are allowed in libraries and things like that. Are those things the federal government should be involved in? Should they be left to the states? What's your philosophy about that?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the United States history is littered with examples of right-wing reactionaries disingenuously using states' rights as a justification to impede people's rights. Look, when it comes to issues like reproductive freedom, a patient, if they are seeing their government interject itself between them and their provider, they don't care whether it's their state government or their federal government. It's government getting in to those intimate, personal decisions that a person is making about their health care that should be best left up to the patient, their provider, and if it's a young person, their family. And so there's no question that the federal government has a role in protecting those individual rights. As I mentioned, history is littered with right-wing reactionaries seeking to justify, mandate, and perpetuate discrimination under the guise of states' rights. But fortunately, history is also filled with examples where the federal government stepped up to fulfill its constitutional and moral obligation to the most vulnerable in our society to protect those rights. They did it in the 1800s with the Emancipation Proclamation. They did it in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act and 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. They did it in the early 90s with the Americans with Disabilities Act. The federal government has a role to protect individual rights, to protect the rights of vulnerable communities in our country. And I think that that continues to be true on reproductive freedom, on voting rights, on LGBTQ rights, and on racial justice.
Speaking of protecting rights and imposing limits, my colleague, student journalist Casey Nyman, has another question for you along those lines. Casey?
Yes, this election season has certainly been an interesting one. We've had some presidential candidates show sign of age, and this has even led one candidate to drop out of the race. Do you think there should be changes to the nomination process for candidates in elective office and the Supreme Court, whether this be a physical exam or maybe a retirement age?
Well, I think voters are probably best able to make determinations around a candidate's fitness for office. I think when it comes to the United States Supreme Court, it is clear that we need structural reforms to address the packing of the Supreme Court that's occurred over the last several years, with Republican politicians creating rules to keep Supreme Court positions open and then violating those same rules they created to then pack the court even further. I think we should be exploring solutions like term limits for Supreme Court justices. When it comes to individual candidates, I am uncomfortable saying that there should be a policy that a candidate has to reveal their medical records, but I do believe that with full transparency, a candidate should be able to demonstrate their fitness. And whether that's revealing and releasing their health records if there are serious questions about that candidate's ability and fitness for office. I think that that's something that a candidate should probably do, but ultimately it's up to the voters to make the decision as to whether that candidate is fit and what the punishment will be if the candidate refuses to be transparent with their health records.
Following up on Casey's question, would you support term limits for the Supreme Court for members of Congress? Would you support a limit on your own term in Congress if you're elected?
Well, I think there should be Supreme Court limits because as it stands right now, you're appointed and you are on the bench for life. That obviously creates a dynamic without any accountability. I think the solution we have here in Delaware is a reasonable one, where there is essentially a 12-year term with the option of reappointment, but that every so often a judge has to be reappointed to the bench. I think that's an appropriate mechanism here in Delaware. It's a good mechanism. Look, we have something called term limits. We have term limits. They're called elections. And I think the reality is that when you have a legislative body with 435 people, having new members with creativity and energy met with older members with seniority and experience, sometimes over decades, I think that creates a better conversation, and I think it often creates better solutions.
In our final segment, we'd like to ask a few questions about some other pressing national issues. I want to ask you about social media. Do you think social media companies like TikTok or Facebook or Google or X, just to name a few, should be held accountable for the spread of false and misinformation that affect the democratic process in the U.S., and not just in the U.S., but actually globally? Would you support some kind of regulations or penalties or perhaps something else? And would that kind of regulation, in your view, bump up against free speech provisions in the First Amendment?
So look, I think that if social media were a traditional brick and mortar industry, we would have seen regulation years ago. But unfortunately, and I think this also might be a byproduct of not enough members of Congress who are engaging in social media themselves and maybe not understanding the internet more than as a series of tubes. I think the reality is we have to regulate this industry. We need thoughtful regulation, we need balanced regulation, but social media platforms are platforms, and the algorithm elevates certain voices over others. And so one, I believe that respecting proprietary information for an individual company, we need some level of transparency with regard to the algorithms. But two, we do need to hold social media companies accountable when misinformation and disinformation spreads. Do I think that if I post something on social media that's untrue, that social media company should immediately face punishment? No. They aren't responsible in that instance.
Because you posted it.
Because I did post it. But they are a publisher in many ways, and so if they allow for that disinformation and misinformation to persist, if the government does not believe they are taking reasonable steps to address disinformation and misinformation, I do believe there should be some level of accountability and liability for those social media companies if they don't, with urgency and due diligence, seek to address the spread of disinformation and misinformation.
Another national issue, I'm going to turn to our student journalist colleague, Casey Nyman, for our next question. Casey?
Yes, Senator McBride. The issue of available housing for young new home buyers, low-income home buyers, and the homeless is reaching crisis proportions. Do you think that Congress should step in to aid with this issue, or should it be left to the states?
Housing is one of those issues where there is a local component, a state component, and a federal component. And I think the federal government has an important role to play to address housing costs with investment in particular. This is a classic example of Econ 101, of supply and demand. We simply do not have enough housing for people in this country right now. And the only way to address that cost issue and the underlying sources of the high cost of housing is to build more housing. We have to be smart with how we do that. We have to guarantee, through perhaps the power of the purse at the federal level, that when development does occur, local zoning entities are taking into account sufficient infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, utility infrastructure, education infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure when new development occurs. But we clearly know there have to be more houses. That is the only way, at the end of the day, we're going to be able to bring down the cost of housing. I also believe in targeted financial assistance for first-time home buyers to make sure that we're guaranteeing that step from going from being a renter to going to being a home buyer is more accessible for more people, particularly young people in our society right now. And I do believe that the federal government has a role to play. These housing investments were a critical part of what was called the Build Back Better Act, which was proposed back in 2021 alongside paid family and medical leave, affordable child care, and investments in home care and elder care. I would hope we would pick up the pieces from the Build Back Better Act that fell to the negotiating room floor as it became the Inflation Reduction Act, and housing would be a critical part of that.
Casey?
Yes, I'm about to graduate this year, and since my earliest memories of school, I can remember doing active shooter drills or preparing if there was ever an intruder. What do you think should be done about the repeated pattern of gun violence in the United States?
Well, thank you for that question, Casey. I remember in 2019 when I was knocking on doors, one of the most frequent issues when I was running for the state Senate, one of the most frequent issues I'd hear from parents is the trauma that their children were going through because of those active shooter drills. And thank God we have not seen a mass shooting in a school here in Delaware, but every so often, every year, we are seeing instances where 15, 20 kids in an elementary school or in a middle school or in a high school are slaughtered in cold blood because of all too easy access to not just firearms, but weapons of war here in the United States. In the Delaware General Assembly, I've been not only a champion of gun safety, calling for change after the Uvalde massacre in Texas when roughly 20 young people were slaughtered in their classrooms that resulted in the largest gun safety package in state history. I've been a champion of the recent permit to purchase legislation that requires training for a handgun. And I helped bring Democrats and Republicans together to get guns out of our schools, to say here in Delaware it is clearly illegal to bring a firearm into a public school and a charter school here in Delaware. I believe Congress has to build on the progress we've made here in Delaware by improving background checks, by passing an assault weapons ban, so that we can make our communities safer. Look, there is no question that we can protect individual rights to own a firearm while also taking common sense steps to get weapons of war off of our streets, to make sure guns don't fall into the hands of criminals, and to help guarantee that we're making our schools, our movie theaters, our grocery stores, and our neighborhoods safer.
Senator McBride, I'd like to ask about another issue that you also faced in the Delaware State Legislature. Here in Delaware, the legislature passed, but the governor vetoed, a bill giving people with terminal or incurable diseases the right to choose when they die. I want to ask you whether you would support national legislation guaranteeing a right to die.
Well, thus far I've seen this effort really at the state level, state by state. But I do support an individual's ability to make a decision when they have a terminal illness and are within proximity to their death, the ability to have medical aid in their dying process. And look, this is an issue I've supported in the General Assembly. I voted for the legislation that passed. But I also recognize that there are varying opinions, deeply held personal moral beliefs about this issue that I respect. But for me, I think I come to it based on my experience as the caregiver to the person who would become my husband, Andy, during his battle with terminal cancer. And there were really two issues that tore Andy up about inside, that created a level of anxiety and trauma for him as he was facing death. One was the fear of death, and I couldn't do anything about that. The other was the anxiety over the indignity of feeling a complete loss of individual agency over his own life and over his own future. We can't tell a patient who is about to lose their life to cancer or any other terminal illness, we can't tell them what happens on the other side of death. We can't necessarily alleviate that fear of death. But if we have the capacity to give people back that little bit of individual agency and how that end occurs, I don't know how you can look a person in the eyes and deny them that agency and that dignity.
Final couple of questions, if I may, on a different topic, climate change, which we've only touched on slightly here. Recent storms, of course, have sort of highlighted the role that climate change is playing in our society, in our country. Do you favor construction of the federally approved wind farm off the coast of Delaware with its wires coming ashore in Delaware?
I believe we have to have an all-of-the-above approach when it comes to addressing climate change, and that means seizing the opportunities that come with all sources of renewable energy, including wind energy. This is an opportunity for jobs, it's an opportunity for clean energy. Obviously, we have to make sure that when we're pursuing these opportunities, we're keeping into account local character of the communities, the needs and the interests and the opinions of neighbors. But as I've gone to eastern Sussex and had conversations about offshore wind, I think there's a recognition that if it's done right, it'll have minimal impact on the visual from the beach, while also providing clean, renewable energy to Delawareans in our region and good-paying union jobs in the construction and perpetuation of the wind farm. This is an issue that has to be taken up with the utmost urgency as Delaware's member of Congress, because Delaware is the lowest lying state in the nation. And we don't just face a global existential threat with climate change. Delaware's literal short-term survival is at risk. Many communities in Delaware will be at risk. And so we have to build on the progress of the Inflation Reduction Act at the federal level by continuing to invest in renewables, by pulling policy levers to incentivize the major drivers of carbon emission to reduce their emissions, to invest globally in green technologies, and to make sure that as this green revolution occurs, we're seeing an economy that's filled with good-paying union jobs, and also that the green technologies that are available to consumers, like electric vehicles, are more accessible and affordable for individual Delawareans. That's what I've done in the Delaware General Assembly. I'll continue that work in Congress.
A companion question, and I'll ask you, you've touched on it slightly. I'd like to ask you for a concise answer on this one. Should the federal government authorize offshore oil drilling off the coast of Delaware, the state that you, of course, represent?
No, I don't believe we should be going down that path. I do believe that we have to recognize that domestic sources of oil are part of energy independence in the short term, but I would not like to see us drill offshore in Delaware.
All right, as we conclude our time together, I want to give you a chance to address voters with your closing thoughts, and I'll ask you to try to limit that to a minute, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ralph, and thank you again to the University of Delaware. Thank you, Casey, for your questions. Delaware is at an inflection point. We are going to see a new generation of leadership at the state and federal level come November 5th. And as the Democratic nominee for Delaware's open sole congressional seat, I am incredibly mindful of the responsibility that comes with representing the whole state, all three counties, Democrats, independents, and Republicans, the full diversity of Delaware. That sole member of Congress has to be ready on day one to deliver for Delawareans. In the Delaware State Senate, I've brought Democrats and Republicans together to build a government that more fully respects all of us by helping to raise the minimum wage, pass paid family and medical leave, secure gun safety legislation, protect reproductive freedom, and bring down costs facing patients. Those will be my priorities in the United States House of Representatives. And we need that next member of Congress to be someone with a proven track record of rolling up their sleeves, diving into the details, bringing people together, and deliver real and lasting change. That's why I'm asking for your vote, either beginning on October 25th through early voting or on November 5th.
Delaware State Senator Sarah McBride, thank you very much for participating in Delaware Debates 2024. On behalf of Delaware Public Media and the University of Delaware Center for Political Communication, I'm Ralph Begleiter. Thank you for watching these debates, and I'm encouraging you to cast your ballot sometime by the end of Tuesday, November 5th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.